The list of patients was crisp in my hand. Crisp, clear, and unmuddied, as it always was on the first day of a new month on the wards. After 3 months of being in the clinic, I was back once again on the medical wards. And that means the inpatient service. I knew that the sheet of paper would soon be crumpled and covered with scrawls as I scurried about meeting 36 patients, 2 residents, 4 interns, and 6 medical students. But for now, the paper felt cool, controlled, and reliable in my grip. I was ashamed to admit it, but I was perversely thankful for the numerous comatose patients on my service, because they made rounds faster and left more time to concentrate on the active GI bleeders, the patients in diabetic ketoacidosis, the ones with gram-negative septicemia, and the ones who spoke English. Mrs. Milstein was one such comatose patient, an elderly woman with Alzheimer's disease, who'd been sent from her nursing home in Brooklyn after falling and hitting her head. Overflowing hospital census and pure bad luck conspired to land Mrs. Milstein on 7 East, galaxies away for all intents and purposes from the medical wards on the 16th and 17th floors. The combination of her flatline mental status and her location in the hinterlands of the hospital ensured that my visits would be brief and infrequent. The previous attending had told me that he'd spoken with the patient's sister in Florida, the social worker from the nursing home, as well as the patient's rabbi. All assured him that Mrs. Milstein would not want any aggressive measures. A DNR had been signed, and the plan was to place a permanent feeding tube, then return the patient to her nursing home. I poked my head in Mrs. Milstein's room on that first day on the wards. I saw a white-haired elderly lady, either sleeping or unconscious, but clearly comfortable. She was breathing well, and her vitals were stable. I nodded to myself, checked off the box on my now slightly rumpled list of patients, and continued with my rounds. I had no plans to call the sister or do any additional work for this patient, since the previous attending had settled the main issues and a clearly defined plan was in place. But then the question arose as to whether Mrs. Milstein would have considered the planned permanent feeding tube to be invasive, and this decision would require consultation with the family. So I dialed the phone, and a heavily Eastern European accented voice met my ears. "Yes, I am Goldie. I am her sister." I explained to Goldie that I was taking care of her sister, that I was the new doctor on the wards. She told me that Dora would never want any painful or invasive procedures. We agreed that a permanent feeding tube would not be necessary, that the temporary tube was okay, given Mrs. Milstein's comatose state and her likely abbreviated life expectancy. And we agreed that the patient would not get any IVs or any future blood draws. Dora was a very cheerful person, Goldie told me. Everybody loved her. I paused, looking up from the furrowed and rutted patient list on which I'd been jotting the notes of our conversation. Cheerful, I mused, turning my hands over. It was always hard to imagine a comatose patient ever having been cheerful. The transfer process moved along. Papers were signed and stamped. Transportation services were arranged. Necessary authorizations were obtained. On the day of transfer, as I readied myself to cross one more patient off my now well-worn list, the social worker noted the last set of vital signs. There was a fever. The great machinations of interhospital transfer ground to a halt. Nobody, it seemed, could be transferred anywhere, anytime, at any stage of illness with a core body temperature other than 98.6 degrees. Despite my protestations that the patient was already receiving oral antibiotics, that she would not undergo any blood cultures or be given IV antibiotics, that she had a DNR order, that the medical team would not do anything about this fever, that in fact it was actually expected that this patient would have a fever, the social work rule was ironclad. I would not be able to cross Mrs. Milstein off my list. It was already quite late in the day, but I decided to call Goldie. I assumed we'd have a quick conversation and that she would be in agreement with my judgment that her sister could indeed return to her nursing home despite the peregrinations of her body temperature. I glanced at my watch as I dialed her number, packing my stethoscope and crumpled patient list in my bag to leave for the evening. Goldie sounded delighted to hear from me. She asked me if Dora looked comfortable, and I said yes. Dora had such a hard life, Goldie said. I am much younger, and she was like a mother to me. In the casual voice of someone recounting her afternoon shopping, she added, "We went through the camps together, you know. She took care of me after we lost our parents. She is the reason I survived." My hands abruptly ceased their activity and drew together with interlocked fingers, awkwardly making their way down into my lap. Goldie and I proceeded to talk for the better part of an hour. Goldie told me about Dora's escape in Europe, their harrowing adventures in the forest, their long journey to America. After the phone call, I went back to Mrs. Milstein's room. I put down my bag, pulled up the empty visitor's chair, and sat next to Mrs. Milstein, next to Dora. The sun had already set over the East River, and the darkness from the windows was a rigid wall of black behind me. I looked at Dora under the fluorescent bedlight for what seemed like the first time all month. Her white hair was neatly brushed, and someone had tied it with a fanciful green bow. Her parchment skin was folded in fine wrinkles over her tranquil, sleeping face. There was not a trace of agony or stress. Dora's left arm lay open on the bed atop the neatly tucked white sheets. There were the numbers. I hadn't seen them before because I hadn't looked closely. Blue-green numbers, faded with time, but still legible. I had never seen tattooed numbers up close, and I wasn't prepared for the reflexive chill that they would cause. Haltingly, I placed my index finger on the numbers. I had never before touched tattooed numbers, and I don't know what I feared. The numbers were simply frightening to touch. I rubbed my fingers over her skin tentatively, and the silkiness of the soft side of her arm, the part that had remained free from a lifetime of sun damage, it calmed me. The numbers, of course, did not smudge or disappear with my rubbing, despite my irrational thought that they might. I let out the breath that had been caught inside me and leaned in closer. Her fragrance, a combination of baby powder, betadine, and the vague sourness of the sick, enveloped me and froze me in that moment. I was touching Dora's skin, the same skin that had been wrenched by a Nazi soldier, stabbed by a metal plate of tattoo needles, and then abraded with blue ink rubbed into the wounds. My fingers could almost feel the shivers and gooseflesh that must have rippled through the supple skin of a teenage girl, one hand stiffened in a soldier's clench, the other gripping the hand of her little sister. More than a half-century later, I was standing in the same position and handling the very same flesh as that Nazi. I shuddered to think of the connection that my fingers were making, that I could have a link with that German soldier whose name would never be known, but whose features and touch, I imagined, were seared into Dora's now quiescent mind. I was grateful that between then and now, there had at least been decades of loving touch from a devoted sister and a husband, 60 years of caresses to mitigate somewhat the vicious touch that had assaulted the tender underbelly of her arm and branded it with those numbers. And now, I was part of that chain of touch. The next morning, as I girded myself for battle with the bureaucracy to get my patient transferred back to our nursing home, despite the fluctuations of mercury, the intern came up to tell me that Mrs. Milstein had died at 8:20 p.m. the previous night. 8:20 p.m., 30 minutes after I had left her bedside. I stared at my fingers, rubbing the pads, suddenly entranced by the whorls and creases. Of all the thousands of fingers that had touched Dora in her 80 years of life, from the first that had brought her into this world as a fragile infant, through the many that had touched her with either violence or affection, could mine have been the last? These callous bits of skin that I scrubbed daily and unthinkingly with desiccating antimicrobial soap, that I sheathed and unsheathed with airless latex gloves, that casually grasped my ever-crumpling list of patients, these may have been the last in this particular chain. Many industries have been automated, and medicine is no exception. I can't deny the increased efficiency provided by computerized lab results, telemetry monitoring, and wireless email. But no matter how much our field is pushed to streamline to maximize efficiency, there is an asymptotic limit. In the end, medicine will always be about one patient and one physician or one nurse together in one room, connecting through the most basic of communication systems, touch. In an age of breathless innovation, this is almost antediluvian. But medicine simply cannot be automated beyond this point. Every so often, when the chaos of clinic and ward life becomes overwhelming, I dump my computerized list of patients, the review article I've been reading, my Palm Pilot, my triplicate prescription pad, and whatever else I happen to be carrying onto the nearest table. I place my hands flat on the surface, absorbing its comforting smoothness, then spread my fingers and contemplate their outlines. These, more than our stethoscopes, more than our textbooks, more than our clinical practice guidelines, these are our most fundamental diagnostic and therapeutic tools. I realize that I am grateful for the inefficiencies of medicine and for their steadfast ineradicability, and then I gather up my other tools, sigh, and move on. Thank you very much.